Welcome to Lesson 10 on Design for Driving. In this lesson, we are going to be discussing IPDE. Now, IPDE is defined as a process or strategy of driving. Let's take a look at it. I, identification or identify. P, predict. D, decide. And E, execute. This is our primary process or strategy for driving. Let's remember it. I, P, D, and E. Okay, Linda?
Yeah, let's discuss this whole process now, Howard. The IPDE process, we call it a process or a strategy for driving. You all know that the better students have strategies for studying. We all have to develop these strategies in order to become good students. It could be your strategy is to lay in bed and study at night with a glass of milk, or it could be your strategy for studying would be to sit in front of the television and the radio going, and that's your strategy. You've made a plan. Now, as we are children, we all basically use this IPDE process, but in a very simple form. Let's say we're walking down the street as a little youngster. We learn that when we see something in our path, that we actually have to change our own path of travel. But as we apply this process to driving itself, it becomes a little more complex. Now, let's take a look at this process. The actual process of driving really starts with the eyes. Okay, this is your identifying. It starts with the eyes. And then the process, from whatever your eyes see, all of the nerve impulses go up to the brain. And at that point, the brain has to make a few decisions and predictions, and it has to go through a few processes. And then it goes down to your hands and feet. Now, let's take a look at it a little more closely. Most people believe, or especially new students, think that when they start driving, how well they handle the car is all a matter of your hands and feet. But really, driving is more of a mental task. When you get into driver's training, your driver's training simulator instructor and your driver's training car instructor will really be more interested in what's happening up here so much than with your hands and feet. What you do, how you handle the steering wheel, how you handle the brake and the gas pedal will all be reflected in what's happening up here with your eyes and up here in the brain. So this is why in driver's training they do become more concerned with the seeing process and the thinking process, more so than the actual doing process. Now, let's take a look at this on a chart. As we can see here, in identifying, it really is more of a seeing process. This is where your eyes are actually doing the looking and your scanning, and in a later lesson we will talk more about things to look for, where to look, and we will help you with the identifying part of driving. Predict and decide. These are both thinking processes. predict and decide. Now you can see in this whole scheme, IPDE, that the brain really does most of the work. After you see, then the processes go to the brain, and the brain, first of all, has to make a prediction, and it has to predict all of the possibilities that could happen in that situation. And then the brain has a second and third step. The second thing is that it has to decide how to handle the situation if all these different occurrences happen. Then, once the brain makes that decision, then the brain has to send the message down to the hands and feet on what to do, how to handle the situation. Now again, this is really a process we all go through in our everyday lives, walking down the street or riding a bicycle. But in driving, again, it becomes a little more complex, and you have to make split-second decisions sometimes. Now, we've seen and we've used our brain. Now the actual physical part of driving, the doing part, comes in when you execute. This is where you actually do what your brain has told you to do. So the IPDE process is really a seeing, a thinking, and a doing process. These are the three steps. And again, at this point, and when you get into driver's training, we are really more concerned with the seeing and the thinking part of it. The doing part, if you're seeing and thinking, and seeing the things you should be seeing and thinking the things you should be thinking, then the doing part will come very naturally, and with a little practice, you'll become an expert driver, and you'll become a very safe driver too, and this is what we're concerned with. Now, it sounds like this is the ideal situation, and you know, how can anybody constantly do this out on the road, use this IPDE process? It's very difficult for any one person to use it at all times, 100% of the time when you're out on the road. But the idea is that at this point in your driving career, we want to make you very aware of it. As you know, your insurance rates are going to be very high until you're about age 25, and it's because teenagers do have more accidents than more experienced drivers. And the experienced drivers, the only difference is that they have been exposed to so many trial and error situations that they have learned this IPDE process. It may not be a conscious process, but they have learned it really through trial and error. But we want to make you aware of it now so that you won't have to go through that trial and error period. You are going to constantly be using this IPDE process, and therefore you will not have as many accidents as perhaps other people will. Now, what is the importance of these 4 steps? Can we have a breakdown in any one of these steps and still get through everything all right? Howard?
All right, Linda. Now, like with any other thing, whenever we remove one of the particular elements, whether it be the identifying, which is the seeing, the predicting, deciding, which is the thinking portion, or the doing, the whole system will have a tendency to almost collapse. So what we need to really do is give the driving task our full concentration. Now, I'm certain that many of us have experienced the idea of getting up in the morning, and maybe we have something on our mind, and we'll be walking the street, and perhaps because we were not seeing, our attention was focused on our thoughts rather than on the sidewalk ahead of us, that perhaps we tripped over something, and we became angry because we felt, hey, now that really doesn't belong there. What we really should have done is we should have been focusing our attention on where we were walking rather than trying to focus our attention on our problems. And this is something that occurs in driving. If we don't focus our attention on the driving task, we are not going to see the things that we should be seeing. We may see them with our eyes, but we may not see them with our brain, which is where the visualization really takes place. So perhaps we'll see them with our eyes, but yet not identify them. And then we take a look at the thinking process, the predicting and the deciding. Again, if our attentions are concentrated on something other than the driving task, this could certainly interfere with our ability to predict what could happen. again, we have seen with our eyes, but not with our brain because we're thinking of something else.
Right.
So what happens as far as the prediction stage, we don't predict because we haven't seen with the brain. We haven't been able to decide on what evasive maneuver or what we will do in case of that this situation arises because, again, our brain has been muddled with the thoughts that we have on our mind rather than concentration on the driving task. And the execution may be an automatic reflex. That is, it may not be because we've gone through the process of identifying the potential hazard or the danger, then predicted that what may occur, decided what we would do, and then have executed. So really what we need to do is we really need to focus our attention on the driving task. And as you said, it's not 100% of the time because there are things that interfere.
Right.
But even though driving can be fun, we cannot lose sight of the driving task, the idea of identifying potential hazards or dangerous situations, predicting what we may do if this potential hazard or the situation arises.
Now, what if I make a wrong prediction? What if I thought I thought of all of the possibilities, but I did make a wrong prediction?
We should always predict the worst. And in predicting the worst, we then are able to make the adjustment more or less down. And in this downward adjustment, we have the ability to predict things that are not quite as hazardous or as dangerous as what we originally believed, because we always want to predict the worst thing that's going to happen.
Okay.
So what we really want to do is focus our attention on the driving task, and therefore the IPDE process will be more than just seeing with the eye and then the reflex. It will be seeing with the eye and the brain, predicting the worst, deciding what evasive maneuvers we will be taking, and then executing our maneuver based upon the seeing and thinking process. Now, we are going to be taking a look at a film that discusses the IPDE process.
Right. Okay. We're about to show you the kind of driving that goes on every day, so that you can see what most people usually don't realize, that driving exposes you to serious risks. Later we'll get into what you can do to avoid most of those risks, and what you can do to deal with those you can't avoid. Okay, Paul, run through it the first time.
Okay.
Like most drivers with years of experience, Paul keeps his eyes on the road, with an occasional glance at his rearview mirror and speedometer. In general, he just takes it easy. Now Paul's got a van behind him, but he doesn't consider that a problem. Paul and the driver behind him are on a through street. Ahead, there's an intersecting stop street like the one Paul just turned off of. And parked opposite the intersection, there's another driver, looking at a map. There's not much chance that this driver will create any risks for Paul, is there? But let's slow things down a little. Because down that stop street, another car, a station wagon, is moving toward the intersection. Paul's hardly heading into a traffic jam. But now he sees there's a car coming toward him. It's going to reach the intersection at about the same time he will. But Paul keeps right on going. What risks is he taking? The parked car doesn't leave much room, and the driver of the red car has to steer precisely. What if the wagon starts into the intersection? And is the driver behind Paul alert? Paul's depending on the driving skills of all four other drivers. If there's one mistake or misjudgment, Paul has no clear escape route. So what happens? Nothing. Every day, most drivers repeatedly get into situations as loaded with risks as the one you've just seen. Luckily, those risks don't always materialize. But when they do, well, let's go back to the start. And this time, let's see how those risks can be avoided. Or if they can't be avoided, how they can be dealt with effectively. Actually, you accomplish this automatically when you drive perceptively. Now, that means when you drive, you identify important details in the driving situation. You predict the risks present in it. You decide on the safest course of action, and then you execute that action. Let's take the first letter of each word. Identify, predict, decide, and execute. And you get IPDE. Let's put IPDE into practice and see how it works. Okay, Paul, run through that again.
Right.
But this time drive perceptively.
Okay.
Okay. Notice this time that Paul follows a coordinated plan as he prepares to drive. Preparing to drive this way will save you time and trouble. Now to apply the IPDE process to driving. First, identify. To do that, you have to look. And that's why Paul is continually scanning. He never fixes on anything longer than 2 seconds. He keeps searching the driving environment for clues. For example, Paul monitors the performance of his car by checking his instrument panel. And he uses his rear and side view mirrors to find out what's going on around him. Of course, Paul also makes sure he knows what's up ahead. What does he look for around him? The condition of the road, that's important. So are regulatory signs and signals that affect him or the traffic he meets. And so is other traffic, other vehicles, pedestrians, and animals. Look through the windows of parked and moving cars, and when possible, even under cars, for clues to danger. Is she about to open her door and get out? Maybe she's about to start driving. Okay, let's talk about the distances that allow the perceptive driver the time to apply the IPDE process. First, we'll discuss the distance between you and the traffic that's moving with you, whether they be ahead or behind you. Now, the rule used to be, allow 1 car length for every 10 miles per hour of speed. But most of us, it turns out, don't estimate, say, 4 or 5 car lengths with any degree of accuracy. So what can you do? Well, pick a stationary object near the road. We'll use me for an example this time. Start counting when the first car passes me. 1001, 1002, and the following car should pass me at least 2 seconds later. Now, up to 40 miles per hour, if you're following with this 2-second interval, you have just enough time to react if the car ahead brakes. If the car behind you isn't at least 2 seconds away, that driver won't have enough time to react if you have to brake. Over 40, a 4-second interval is needed. Now, besides staying at least 2 seconds distance from potential hazards moving with him, A perceptive driver scans the environment for potential hazards that aren't moving with him, like children, parked cars with people behind the wheel, or maybe a telephone pole. He'll need at least 4 seconds of reaction time for these, so he looks for anything that could interfere with him in that length of time. In addition, he's learned how much time 12 seconds is, and learned through experience how far he'll go in that time at various speeds. He scans 12 seconds ahead to minimize the chances of being surprised and being forced to make sudden responses. By now, Paul is already checking the intersection ahead. There's the possibility of cross-traffic from the right. What other details is he identifying? The parked car ahead on the left, with signals flashing. The car might move, so he'll watch for it. Paul's identified that there's an oncoming car too, and he predicts immediately that it may reach the intersection about the same time he does. The station wagon on the cross street adds another risk. And, of course, Paul's kept track of the van behind and hasn't let it get too close. After identifying these elements, Paul predicts the risk of each hazard. Is it getting closer to him? Is it likely to collide with him? Clearly, Paul's closing with the red car and could collide with it. The wagon presents a similar risk, doesn't it? Is there much likelihood of colliding with the parked car? It is getting closer. What other problems could it cause? What's the closing potential with the van? And what's the probability of a collision? As you've seen, arriving at the intersection at the same time as the oncoming car and the stopping car presents unnecessarily great risks. A decision must be made. If Paul has time, he can either slow down or speed up, so he'll meet those risks at separate times. He could also adjust his lane position to help minimize the risk. But what if Paul doesn't have the time? Well, then he should decide on the speed and position that will expose him to the least serious of the several risks. Now that Paul's made his decision, what should he do? Well, that's the E in IPDE, execution. After deciding on the safest course of action available, the perceptive driver must then execute that action skillfully. The action that is executed depends on the identifying, predicting, and deciding done beforehand. What you've seen has introduced IPDE to you in one situation. But when you drive, you aren't going to confront isolated situations any more than you'd be able to shift into slow motion. No, you'll find one situation flowing steadily into another and another. And the IPDE process works in all of them.
It really does work in all of them. And again, as he said, that was only one situation at one intersection that we were really looking at. And as you saw, driving really is a mental task and not a physical task. We can teach often people who have physical handicaps, we can teach them how to drive. So really, even having arms and feet is not necessary because we can still teach people to drive without them. But again, we really are more concerned with the mental task of driving, what's happening here with your eyes, and that's why they do check your eyes when you go down to get your driver's license. And we're also concerned with the mental processes there.
Right. And not only we should remember the thinking process, let's go back and again take a look at the particular steps that we have in the IPDE process and what they stand for, Linda. Take a look at I, identify. That is, identify potential hazards or dangerous situations. And again, as you said, Linda, this is more than seeing with the eyes, it is seeing with the brain as well.
Right.
P, predict. Is the driver able to predict the potential hazard and what will happen?
Right, and we saw in the film that the gentleman had to make several predictions on all those different hazards.
Right. And again, this is the thinking portion, and as well as the decide. Decide is, again, the ability to think, and we should not, and in losing sight of a driving task, These are the two steps that oftentimes are lost, the prediction, the predicting, and the deciding. And then finally, E, execute. And as we discussed earlier, Linda, the ability to execute is not always based upon a mental decision. It may be a reflex action stimulated by fear, or it could be just an instantaneous visual thing, and we respond. We haven't taken the time to predict or decide. That is the actual thinking.
Okay, Howard, let's see how IPDE fits into our activity for this lesson.
Okay, Lynn. Now, what we would like to have you do is really an activity that involves doing rather than sitting down and spending your time thinking about this. We want you to ride with maybe in a car with a friend of yours, or perhaps on the bus, for a period of 1 hour. Maybe you'll be going to the beach or to the store, to a movie. This can be broken down into 5, 10, or 15-minute segments. And as you are riding with your friend, or on the bus perhaps, we would like to have you note down things. Did the driver identify potential hazards or situations? Did he then predict what would happen? Did he predict that this potential hazard would become a reality? Did the driver decide as to what he was do in the event that the prediction did become a reality? And then in the event it does become a reality, is he capable, and not only that, does he actually execute the maneuver? As an example of what you're going to be doing, let's take a look at this. Did the driver identify the potential hazard or situation that arose? That is, the second motorcycle coming out from behind the truck. Did the driver predict that there would be a second motorcycle and that it may appear from behind the truck? Did the driver make a decision? Did he decide on what evasive maneuver or what action he would take in the event that the second motorcycle did appear or come out from behind the truck? And finally, was the driver able to execute the maneuver? That is, either slow down, stop, or whatever. Now,